Fallout 4 the most philosophically profound game in modern gaming? Let's find out, people. What's up, nerds? Welcome back to Nerd Valley, where we talk about all things Elder Scrolls and Fallout. Over the past few weeks, we've kind of just been on the Elder Scrolls side of things, due to the release of Oblivion Remastered. But today, I want to switch it up a bit and talk about Fallout, specifically everyone's favorite, Fallout 4. The reason I want to talk about Fallout 4 in particular is because I've thought a lot about its story recently, which, while understandably criticized for its main story involving Nate, Nora, and Sean, I've always felt the other ideas and concepts that are brought up to surround that are way more interesting than most other games, not even just in the series. I say this because in most other games, the focus throughout gameplay is the story, obviously. It isn't the philosophical questions it tries to raise. Sure, characters might take a break from the story to wax poetic at you about metaphysics and religion and politics, but it isn't exactly what they want you focused on the entire time. Fallout 4, on the other hand, does seem to have a specific concept it wants you to focus on more so than its main story and characters, which is post-humanism. Specifically, the areas of post-humanism that deal with humanity evolving by combining with technology, or technology evolving by becoming like humans. So, obviously, talking about the synths. I mean, with all the advancement we've seen over the past few years in areas regarding AI, robotics, prosthetics, and even Musk putting brain chips on the horizon, we watch as stories like this, or iRobot, or Terminator become way more relevant than they were when they were released. So relevant, in fact, I can remember a few years back in college when my philosophy professor posed a very similar question, which was if an entity or organization could find a way to clone you almost perfectly with organic material, and then they implanted all of your memories and experiences into that, would it then be you? Now, I don't think my professor was realistically trying to talk about sense. I think instead he was trying to have a conversation about consciousness and whether or not there's something deeper that plays a role in how people deal with experiences rather than just what their experiences are. But any Fallout fan can probably tell why I got so interested in this question to then write an entire paper on the philosophy of Fallout 4 that I'm essentially now going to relay to you guys. So to kick it all off, let's kind of start with the question my philosophy professor asked. Are the synths exactly what they're trying to replicate? Because in my opinion, it's a resounding no. The reason I say that is because even without consciousness, or the idea that this being might have its own consciousness, the moment that it is awake and experiencing new things, it is already becoming a different thing, if memories are all that we are. The moment it woke up or came online or whatever, it already made new memories and experiences that the original never did, and thus is already a different being, at least slightly. However, if we're not just memories and we do take consciousness into account, then I still say it's a no, because regardless of how people might feel, the synths very clearly have their own. So I don't know, it's more like, I would see more like a sleeper agent. They're not the new person. They're just being hypnotized into thinking that they're the new person. So with that, they wouldn't exactly be you so much as just think that they're you because they have your memories. And I mean, sure, you could say that Fallout has magic science, and almost every robot you come across feels a little sentient, which is kind of true. But there is one thing that not every single robot throughout the Fallout universe does. Only the synths really do it, and that is to question its own existence, or the meaning and impact of its own existence. In nature, obviously, lots of things are alive, but from what we can tell, we're the only thing that questions that. Where did it come from? Where is it going? What does it all mean? These, in a way, are human questions, and yet they are the exact questions we see the synths constantly asking themselves and asking other people about themselves. It all actually reminds me of this Tool song called Writin' 2, where there's a line in it in which one of the angels depicted in the song says, "Repugnant is a creature that would squander the ability to lift an eye to heaven and be conscious of his fleeting time here." Basically stating, from what I can tell, that the angels see humans as the only creature God gave sentience to, and yet we waste it. But the main part I'm kind of focused on is that whole squander the ability to lift an eye to heaven and be conscious of your fleeting time here, because it is essentially that whole idea of aware of mortality, aware of the end, aware of the fleetingness of existence. The synths are very much aware of these things and concerned with them. And it isn't just about humans understanding that things will end, it's also humans' capability to understand the consequences of things and the role that they play within them, which is kind of what I'm getting at. The ability for one to ponder on the self is almost sometimes what we characterize sentience as, and the synths very clearly have that. Now, that means they definitely aren't who they're trying to replicate, but they are instead their own free minded individual. But for now, I want to put a pin in that. Remember that because we'll come back to it later. But we're gonna move on to the next question so we can fully formulate this idea. Because the next question I want to ask is: are the synths alive? No, I don't think so. No, that might sound confusing, right? How can something not be alive but be conscious and sentient? Which I kind of question why anyone would question. There's already so many people in our world now that think that the AI and robotics we have right now is sentient and conscious. So I feel like it's not a huge leap. Especially because, remember, magic science, people. Now, the main reason I feel this way is because of Synth Sean. Almost entirely because of Synth Sean, or more so how the Institute heads felt about working on Synth Sean and why. That reason mainly being because synths don't seem to age. Which, when you first think about that, probably makes a little bit of sense. I mean, none of the other android robots in sci fi media are like aging either, and they're also meant to replicate humans. Which I've always thought was super weird in these things. You're gonna send something out into society to camouflage with it and integrate with it, and you're not gonna make it age. You don't think people are gonna raise questions when Pop Pop is 120 and still kicking? Huge what the fuck moment right there. Now, you could argue that replacing people isn't their whole goal, so they aren't worried about perfect replication, except I would say that they obviously are. Now, clearly, I don't think their whole goal is to replace everybody. They don't even have a real interest in being topside, it seems like. However, they are very interested in making the synths just like humans, to the point that it is constantly being battered over your head just how indistinguishable they are from people. And they pretty much are, besides the whole age thing. I mean, we even see them eat and sleep and drink, even though the Institute tells us that this is only for camouflage reasons and isn't for survivability at all. Now, look, I'm going to get into that right now because I question that very much for one specific reason: energy. Everything in life needs energy. People get it from eating and sleeping, and we store it in fat, aka weight gain. I thought it would make the most sense for synths to be the exact same way, especially for camouflage. But apparently, I'm an idiot. I mean, not aging, I can kind of see. If you want to make something that's like human but a little bit better, then yeah, make it not age. It's like the one downfall. But we don't just need food and sleep for nutrition, mental health. That is our energy, like I said. So why not just solve one problem while solving another? What I mean by that is, imagine if you make something, robot, whatever, you want it to move around and operate like a person does, you're going to need to find a way for it to sustain its energy, for it to sustain its energy on its own. But you also need them to be discreet about it, not just to humans, but to the synth themselves. So you can't have a charging cable, you can't have charging pods, you can't have them constantly using defibrillators, and you can't have them migrating back to the Institute every once in a while whenever their muscles start to feel a little stiff. And on top of the whole discreet thing, you also need them to be able to camouflage into a human's day to day activities. So they're already going to have to eat, sleep, digest the food they probably eat, because I assume they're not just crapping out chewed mutt fruit and pissing straight Nuka Cola without raising some eyebrows. So, I mean, it's right there. They need energy, they need to camouflage. Humans eat and sleep regularly to get energy. Boom, problem solved. But the Institute says no. So what's up? Did Bethesda forget that everything needs energy to exist? Would we be surprised? No, but I don't think that's what's happening here. So, what is happening? Well, I think the Institute in this instance is kind of showing that They either don't fully understand the sense, or they're just hiding the information that they do understand, or they have some insight into a deeper understanding but are being willfully ignorant of it in order to protect their notions. And we see signs of this all over the game, particularly with Father. I mean, ask him about the sense and he will downplay the technology, basically calling them glorified toasters incapable of decision making. However, one of the first missions he sends you on is to collect a synth that has become a raider, and not just for property reasons, but to show you why the railroad is impractical. Which is because if they free the synths, then they can make their own decisions, and those decisions can be bad. Which is a stupid argument for about 100 reasons. But it mainly disproves the first thing he said about them, which is that they can't make their own decisions, because I am certain the railroad did not program him into a raider. And this is one of many cases that show that the Institute either possibly doesn't understand the sins or are misrepresenting what they do understand about the sins. Another one that possibly even points at an entirely different issue is the fact that many sins claim they can dream. And you might have some suggestions as to what this could be. So let's start off with the obvious. Are the synths dreaming of electric sheep? I don't know. The data was inconclusive. We're going to have to get back to that one. But moving forward, a lot of you might think that it's their way of allowing the synth component to process data and or relay that data to the institute. But I don't think so, because again, they claim it is just for pleasure and camouflage. They make no mention of sleep time data processing. If you infer from this that they then must not be aware that the synths are doing this on their own, then that is a clear sign of misunderstanding, as well as a huge sign of consciousness. Which is the whole reason I went on this tangent, to basically counter my original answer to the "are they alive" question, because now I think that they might be. The more I thought about it, I don't think you can actually really trust what any institute head says, especially because I don't think their research actually goes as deep as they claim. They are a very small scientific community, especially in regard to the gargantuanly advanced technology they're working on. So I doubt the amount of research being done on the created synths is substantial. I don't think they're actually running tests to see if they gain weight or to see if they have brain activity when they're not physically conscious, or even to see if they're aging. At this point, I don't even know if they've had the time to really tell that. I think it's very similar to what people fear about technology in our real world. A lot of folks don't think that the creators of AI have full control or understanding of what they're creating. However, a lot of those programmers believe that the ideas proposed by other people are wild because they claim to know what they did and didn't make their program do. I see this concept as a manifestation of that fear in the harshest form. An organization has created legitimate life, and yet to escape the consequences of those implications, they are lying, they're downplaying it, or they're just ignoring the red flags they see when they're testing it out. So, with all that said, let's recap on those questions we've asked so far. They can't be what they're trying to copy because they are consciousness on their own. They are sentient. And they might be alive, depending on the trustworthiness or untrustworthiness of the Institute. So, let's keep those in mind as we move on and we ask this next question. Are they justifiably property? In a legal sense, no, because they don't actually have any laws in their world. But if we were to bring them over to ours, which is like the whole point of this video, then maybe. Reason being is that they didn't make them in a lab. This means they probably have a formula to how they made them. They probably have other tools they had to create. They had other things like the synth component. And in our world, they probably have a patent on some of that technology. So, I think they'd have everything they need. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a deeper understanding, but I think they would have all that they would have to have in order to prove in a court of law that the synths are their property. But that wasn't really the question I was asking. They might be legal. All this might be legal in our real world. However, historically, especially for the main demographic of the Institute heads, lots of people have labeled other people as legal property and it not be morally justifiable because slavery is bad, which is obvious. But the argument here is whether this is slavery, and I feel like it still is. Even now, people get upset at the usage and treatment of AI and robots in their current state, which is very primitive in comparison to what the synths are. So, if they were almost exactly like us, or as the game says, indistinguishable from us, with clear signs of sentience, then yes, I think slavery would be the word to get used, and rightfully so. The main reason being is it doesn't matter whether they were created in a lab. The one question I for sure said yes on is that they are conscious, they have sentience, and thus they have free will. What I mean by free will in this sense is entirely on their own. They can question their own purpose, create answers for their purpose, and then pursue and achieve that purpose. At a basic level, I would describe that as having free will. And so to not only not give them that opportunity, but to actively block it would be to take that free will away, which is one of the most ultimate bads. Slavery is literally taking away someone's free will. And even if you boil that down to one's own ability to decide for themselves, then a lot of the most unforgivable crimes can be described as messing with or taking away free will. And if the synths have that, then them being the Institute's property blocks that, and thus, no, I don't think the synths are justifiably property of the Institute. They can maybe defend it in a court of law, but I definitely think there would be some uproar to it. But if the synths shouldn't be property, then that brings us to the big question of the game, which is what do we do about them? They are already here in massive amounts, so how do you handle that? Well, for starters, you have the Brotherhood option. Just destroy them all. But with how we answer the first few questions, that seems just as bad as the Institute. I mean, even the Brotherhood questline has one of the biggest pushes towards you feeling like synths are people when you have to deal with the conflict of Dance being a synth. This was extremely heartbreaking and swayed my opinion the first time I played the game because I could not bring myself to kill my friend just for what everyone said that he was and that it was bad. Especially as that friend sits there explaining to me how they never felt any different. So, then it must be better to pick the railroad option. And yes, I think that it is. Obviously, there's valid arguments against the railroad being the best option for the Commonwealth as a whole. When it comes to that, I think Minutemen take the cake. But they can easily work together, even in the story. Minutemen have no reason to go up against anybody, and they don't see synths themselves as an enemy, which is proven when they opt for the evacuation protocol during the Institute raid, freeing a bunch of synths and scientists. And on the other side of that, if you fail underground undercover by getting kicked out of the Institute, the Railroad will tell you to side with the Minutemen. They have no quarrels with one another. Like so many people criticize Fallout 4 and the Minutemen in Fallout 4 for the settlement building and the Radiant Quest. But then on the flip side of that, we'll criticize Railroad for having no care for the Commonwealth. But the story isn't about the Commonwealth. It's about the synths and the Institute, so the Railroad served that just fine. If you want to care about the Commonwealth, do the settlement building, do the Radiant Quest, do the Minutemen stuff outside of the main story, because that's the rebuilding. Then you can side with the Railroad for the main story, which ultimately feels like the most good guy option anyway. In terms of that whole, playthrough concept. Now, in the Fallout universe, that is just fine, but bringing it over to our real world, how exactly would freeing them and liberating them work? Would they be citizens? Would they have all the same rights? Would they have to go through a bunch of extreme rights violations just for some people to arbitrarily decide that they deserve those things? Considering they were made in America, can people look at it the same way they look at other issues? I honestly don't know how any of those questions would be answered, but I do know they'd be hot button issues with people taking hard stances on either side of the coin. However, which way should that coin land? I still do believe in that case, the right way of handling it is to liberate them, make them citizens. I mean, if you are going to go as far as to call them sentient and call them alive and call them intelligent, then it feels kind of wrong to then just go, well, we're not going to give you rights, though. But there is one interesting thing about the railroad option. One thing that they seem to agree with the Brotherhood on, which is shown when they destroy the Institute and thus the ability to make any more sense at the end of their story. Which obviously leads to the last question of this video, which is, should the synths have ever been made? No, I really don't think they should have been. So on that front, I do agree with the Brotherhood. This is, as the Brotherhood would describe it, technology run amok. It is quite literally the antithesis of the nuclear bombs, but used just as nefariously, which is the whole dichotomy of the story. You start off the game by witnessing the destruction of nuclear power, which, when seen by the man who created it, caused him to say, "I am become death." A very weird quote, but true nonetheless. But if using nuclear energy to create massive bombs made Oppenheimer the bringer of death, then the Institute using Sean's DNA to mass synthesize humans should make them the bringers of life. Except they're not, because it's still in the wrong hands. Just like nuclear power can be used for good when it comes to its energy capabilities, the synth technology could have been used for good when it comes to things like possibly medical advancement capabilities or some other stuff. Point is, it all depends on who's using it and what they're using it for. So the Institute using it for this weird god playing slave farming experiment is wrong and should have never been done. Now, it might be weird for me to say they should be freed and protected, but also should have never been made. However, I think about it kind of like puppies. Let me explain. A lot of people, when they get a dog, they don't want that dog to have puppies because of the hassle of raising them, fostering them, all that, right? But if your dog does just so happen to get pregnant, you're most likely not going to wait until they're all born and then just start throwing them away. You're going to go through the process, raise them, foster them, and then you're going to go and get your dog fixed so it doesn't happen again. That's kind of how I feel like that this situation. It's the exact same thing. The synths should have never been made. It should have never happened. Now that they're here, we got to take care of them. We got to figure, they're here. We can't blame them for that. We got to make sure the Institute doesn't do it again, though. Obviously, though, Fallout is a video game, which, as I said earlier in the video, has very magic feeling science. So the idea of fully sentient, possibly living entities made by technology is probably still very far-fetched by most programmers and engineers. But to most people that aren't in an advanced technology workspace, this idea seems very real to a lot of them. And we did talk about different things that we see in our real world that are related to this idea, but obviously none of them are quite as extreme as what's actually going on here. But that's kind of the whole point of creating a dilemma within philosophy. You come up with a situation which people have to navigate you that is supposed to give you some sort of idea on what school of thought they fit into regarding a certain topic or concept. No one thinks that a train operator coming to a fork in the tracks with 6 people tied to it is a scene based in a reality. But it is a pretty good way to figure out which moral theory someone might subscribe to. So in the beginning of this video, I actually lied. I don't think the game is trying to get you to think about post-humanism the entire time. Instead, I think they're using the very modern, increasingly relevant, and obvious fear of post-humanism in order to provide alternative perspectives to how people might view other issues in our real world. I mean, if you can believe that an artificially created being is sentient and alive and thus deserving of freedom and agency and rights, then hey, what else can you open your mind to, huh? All right, later, nerds.